I am Grace Yu, the board chair of the 1990 Institute. I want to thank you all for taking your Saturday morning to join us at this workshop. The 1990 Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit, and our mission is to champion fair and equitable treatment for Asian Americans in a constructive US-China relationship through leadership, education, and collaborations. This workshop, which started in 2013, is a key program of the Institute. Today's workshop is about the history and impact of China. We'll start with a discussion by Dr. Tom Gold on how China today is influenced by its culture, philosophy, and history. And then Clay Dubey from USC, US-China Institute, will delve into China's influence on the world by examining some current events involving China. Our goal is to provide you with knowledge and resources so you may gain further insight into contemporary China. For our educators, we designed this workshop to include lesson plan development discussions so you may incorporate a more nuanced examination of China into your curricula. We also created a portal called 1990 for Teachers to share additional resources on China with you. Link to this portal may be found on our website, 1990institute.org. Now, I would like to introduce you to Sandra Penn, the chair of the workshop. She's instrumental in bringing this workshop online so we may make it available to participants outside of California. I'm very proud to announce that we have participants from 34 states at today's workshop. Sandra, take it away.
Thank you, Grace. It's obviously impossible to live a day without touching on something related to China. China's influence is immense and it's growing. We're very grateful to bring back two long-term friends of the Institute, Tom Gold and Clay Dubey, to help us make sense of China. Here's the schedule of the day. Feel free to send your questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentation and jot down your lesson ideas in the Jamboard. We'll be sharing the Jamboard with you during the curriculum discussion period, so please add your input. First up is Tom Gold. He is fluent in Mandarin and spent many years in China. He is a recently minted retired professor of sociology from UC Berkeley. You can read all about his background here. Tom opened our first teachers workshop back in 2013. He will give us a fundamental and refresher presentation on China. Tom, the screen is yours.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sandra and Grace. Am I broadcasting okay?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as Sandra said, I've been involved in these teachers workshops since the beginning in 2013, and I'm very glad to be able to participate again this year. And I don't think there could be a more timely topic than looking at China right now in August of 2022. The division of labor is that I will talk primarily to provide background in helping us understand what's going on in China at a deeper level, looking at history and culture primarily. And Clay Dubey has the opportunity or the task or the burden of trying to help us understand what's going on in China right now. So among the goals that I want to deal with today, excuse me, first is to get across the idea that China is not a monolithic country. We tend to think of China, that there's one thing, but in fact, China incorporates a huge amount of diversity of many different kinds. The Chinese word for China is Zhongguo, which literally means the middle country. Or
do you mind
middle
sharing
people.
screen?
Sorry?
Do you mind sharing your screen?
Whoops. I don't mind at all. If I could find the, Well, I can't find the,
Sam, would you like to help us?
I
share
can't find,
screen?
nothing is popping up to allow me to share my screen.
It's okay. Sam, do you mind? Samuel? Thank you. There you go.
Are we sharing now?
Yes, we are. Let's put up the Go screen, please. There you go. Can you see the screen?
I can see this. I can see the screen, but it is not advancing.
No, it's not advancing, correct. We'll put it here for a second. When you're ready, just let Sam know. Thank you.
I'm ready.
Okay, let's go.
So to go back, my goals, first of all, to stress that China is not a monolithic country, that there's a great deal of diversity in China, that the term that the Chinese use for China, 中国, means the Middle Kingdom, and it incorporates a whole way of life and a view of China and China's position in the world. The main, I think, theme that I'm trying to get across is that today's China is based on thousands of years of history, culture, tradition, and philosophy. And on the one hand, the Chinese are very proud of that. They always talk about 5,000 years of history. On the other hand, China's long history has also been seen as a burden. And how is it possible for China to become a modern country while at the same time figuring out a way to deal with these thousands of years of history, culture, and so on? One important thing that we often tend to overlook, but is also critical to understanding China, is the issue of water and the irrigation system. That this is extremely important, which I'll something to understand, which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. And finally, it's important to realize that China takes the long game perspective in its view of the future. They're not moving day by day, but they, and this comes across, I think Clay will get to this as well, is that China thinks in a very long-term historical sense, in contrast to the way America thinks about things. Okay, now I can't
Next slide.
advance the screen. Am I going to have control of that? Doesn't look like it. How can I get control over my screen?
Just say next slide when you'd like the slide advanced. Thank you.
Okay. So this is a view, an old map, which gives a sense of China seeing itself as the middle kingdom. Okay, next. It's important. So when I talked about diversity, one of the important aspects that we can see diversity is just by looking at a topographical map of China. If you see so when we think about China, mostly we're talking about, if you can see my cursor here, the eastern part, the eastern area of China, which borders on this is the Taiwan Strait, and this is the Pacific Ocean. But this part of China, which is the most densely populated, is really not, it's slightly less than half of the entire geographical area of the country. That we've got Tibet here, which is this, we've got dueling arrows, dueling cursors, I see. That this is the Tibetan area, which is quite mountainous. And then this is the Xinjiang area, which is quite desertified. It's quite a desert. Here we've got a greener area, which is where most of the population is concentrated. So just right off the bat, looking geographically, we can see the diversity and how challenges that are faced by the government and by the people. Next. So the theme that I want to get across is the importance of history, that what I call the past is always present. And I'll be looking at material culture. I've just mentioned geography and nature, the important fact that China has only one coast. This is a big difference from the United States. China has only one coast, which is in the east. And in the west, it is blocked by both the Himalayan mountains and the desert in Xinjiang, the Silk Road area, which is primarily desert. so that we can think of the coast, which is where most of the population is concentrated, and then what we may call the near interior, which is some of the provinces moving towards the west. And we often think of these, say, of Sichuan or Shanxi as being the interior, but in fact, China goes much deeper into the west than those provinces, which is only about halfway across. In the north, you have the Yellow River, which I'll get to in a minute, which is which is often now running dry. And the problem in the north is that there's not enough water for the people and for agriculture. Next. So there are two main rivers, river systems, which divide China and make a big difference in the way of life. In the north, you have the Yellow River, the Huanghe, and in the south, where it's actually more the middle of China, you have the Changjiang, or what we normally call the Yangtze River. And you can see the way that they both start way in the interior of China, especially the Yangtze begins in the Himalayas and goes all the way to the coast. Next. So to pick up on what I mentioned before about the Yellow River, or the Huanghe, it's the river in the north, and it actually is yellow. This is not a touched up photograph. It actually is yellow, and a lot of that is because it brings silt down from its trajectory towards the coast, which has turned it yellow. And in much of China now, because of drought and because of overuse of the river and of the water level in some places is extremely shallow, which adds to the yellow color. And it also drains a lot of silt from the interior, from northern China, all the way into the delta. And there have been places in China now, as it reaches the coast, where there's no water whatsoever. So the Yellow River in some periods doesn't even drain into the ocean. It's the second longest river in China, and the yellow silt we also refer to as loess, so Loess soil, which is characteristic of northern China. It's very thin and tends to blow around quite a bit. And if you've been in northern China, in Beijing, say, in the spring, especially March and April, you have the winds that come off the Gobi Desert, and they pick up a lot of this sand, this loess soil, this silt, and it blows around in places like Beijing. So people wore masks there well before COVID or SARS because of the difficulties of breathing with this loess soil in the air. So in North China, the staple crop is wheat, and the people in China tend to eat for their staple is wheat products such as noodles and steamed bread, or mantou. Next. By contrast, the main river in the middle of China that drains all the way from the Himalayas is the Yangtze River. And you could see just from the photograph here that the south is an extremely different area in terms of topography and in terms of agriculture, whereas the Yellow River often doesn't reach the coast; it dries up. In the south, the problem is too much water. The river tends to flood periodically. And causes damage. The main crop, the main staple in South China is paddy rice. And here we see in this photograph examples of terraced fields where they have taken mountains or hillsides and turned them into fields for paddy rice. And that involves flooding the field for a while growing the shoots and then transplanting them. So here you could see that rice shoots have been transplanted from a concentrated area into these paddy fields. And I think in the one part there towards the river, you can see farmers who are doing the transplanting at that time. but the south of China tends to be wet, excuse me, humid and green. And when people go to China, I encourage them to make sure that they go to North China and to South China, because you can see the dramatic difference across the board between the North and the South, and the sort of challenges that the people and the government face because of this great difference. Next. So perhaps not surprisingly, water control has been an extremely important theme which runs through Chinese history. In fact, there are theories of Chinese history which are based on the question of the ability to control water. And the ability to control water is related to another theme, which is the conquest of nature. Is we tend to think of Chinese and other Asian societies as emphasizing harmony with nature. But in fact, Chinese history, to a large extent, is about controlling nature. And central to that is the issue of water control. And China has a number of culture heroes, one of which is Yu, who lived, if he really lived, in the 21st century BC in Zhejiang, which is a coastal province where Hangzhou is the capital of that province. And he was famous for draining floodwaters, and an example of the ability to control water, to control floods, to make it possible for people to settle in these areas and to engage in agriculture. In a second, we'll see a picture of a place called Dujiangyan, which is in Sichuan province, which in 256 BC was built in order to divert water to prevent floods, to clean up some of the damage from floods which had occurred in that area. Next. Now this, perhaps a little bit salacious cartoon is an illustration of a famous myth called The Foolish Old Man Who Moved the Mountains, or Removed the Mountains. And the story here is that there was a village where there were mountains which blocked access to other villages and to a market. And there was an old man in the village who said, we have to find a way to remove that mountain so that we have access to other villages and to markets for our agriculture. And the way we're going to do that is to just remove the mountain. And everybody laughed at him and said, you can't possibly remove that mountain. It's just too large. It's been there too long. And he said, well, I'll start with my sons. And if we can't complete it in my lifetime, my sons will continue. And if they can't finish removing the mountain, then their sons will continue on until we have moved the mountains and improved the quality of life and conditions for the people in our village. So it's a myth. It's a myth that was actually picked up by Mao Zedong, and in the selected works, one of the essays is called "The Foolish Old Man Who Moved the Mountains," and this is one of the 3 articles that people during the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s were supposed to memorize in total. And it stresses this theme of nature in many ways as an enemy, often hard to work with, but the importance of trying to establish control over nature. So it's important that we recognize this theme going way, way back in Chinese history of controlling nature. Next. Now this is a photograph of Dujiangyan, which is this river system, this water diversion system, which was put up in 256 BC. It's in Sichuan province. And if you visit Chengdu, the capital of the province, one of the day trips you can take is to go to Dujiangyan and see this. And what they were able to do was to split up the water so that it removed the threat of floods. And so this is held up as a major positive example of the control of nature for the benefit and safety of the people who lived in that area, who had been damaged by floods for a very long time. Next. So this idea of controlling nature, especially controlling water, is still an extremely central and important aspect of what's going on in China to this very day. So one of the main examples of this is the Three Gorges Dam, which is in Sichuan province. And the Three Gorges is a very important, very famous scenic spot along the Yangtze River, pretty much in the interior of Sichuan province. And it used to be in 1979, when I was living in China as a student, one of the things that I did was to take a boat through the Three Gorges Dam, and it's places where the river is extremely narrow, extremely treacherous, but the scenery is quite spectacular. But it didn't start with the communist government. Since early in the 20th century, there had been a plan to dam the Yangtze River in the Three Gorges, both for water control and for the generation of electricity, which has been desperately needed in that area. So it turned out that some of the leaders of China during the 1980s and 1990s and even 2000s were hydrologists. They were water engineers. So they were trained to think in terms of controlling the rivers, controlling the water. So they began to build the Three Gorges Dam. And I guess the last time I went through that area was in 2005, actually. And the dam had been completed. And you go through the locks. You can still go through the Three Gorges, but you also go through the dam, which is extraordinarily impressive. It's extremely large and very impressive. But it has there's been a lot of skepticism about the wisdom of trying to dam it up, because it has led to earthquakes and instability in a lot of the territory around there. So it's still it's a work in progress, just to a certain extent. Another major water project, which is still underway, is what's referred to as the South to North Water Diversion Project. Remember, I said that the problem in the South was too much water, and the problem in the North is not enough water. And so these water engineers figured that, and this is again not something that began with the communists, but had been thought of for many, many decades, was how is there a way to divert water from the South to the North? And so they have actually made progress in doing this, is getting water to especially the big major cities of the North, including Beijing. And of course, China still has a major problem of wasting huge amounts of water. But nonetheless, they're figured that one way to deal with this is to divert water from the South to the North. Next. So we can see some details of this here. $62 billion project to move 12 trillion gallons of water over 600 miles. So it began digging this in 2002. And it moves water along 3 routes from the Yangtze River Basin in the south to the Yellow River Basin in the north. Now, there's another major river crossing between the north and the south, between the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, called the Huai River, which I didn't talk about, but it's also involved in this water diversion project. Next. So now, talking about heritage, what the past is always present. There are many things that you can see in China today, which are extremely old and still are important in Chinese culture, in Chinese politics, and the Chinese view of the world. And of course, one of them is the Great Wall. And many people who go to China are much more interested in these historical and cultural aspects instead of the modern achievements, the recent achievements and changes led by the Communist Party. So this is when Richard Nixon went to China in February of 1972. Those of us who are old enough to remember, I was actually living in Taiwan at that time. This was an astounding breakthrough in world politics. And maybe Clay will get to this, but when we think about the optimism caused by Nixon's trip in 1972, the idea that America was going to now play a part in opening China and tapping into the energy and the creativity of the Chinese people, the optimism of that time. And we can contrast that to what's going on now, where there's a lot of thinking, was it a mistake to engage with China? And Nixon, on the one hand, is being thought of as a hero, on the other hand, is somebody who was duped by the Chinese. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of the Nixon trip and of the signing of the Shanghai Communique, which created the foundation for normalization. So on the one hand, you have people celebrating this 50th anniversary. On the other hand, there's a great deal of criticism that this was a mistake. So when we talk about the past always being present in China, there's so many aspects of what I call the built heritage, which you can see all over the place. The Great Wall is being one of the most famous, but there are monuments, palaces, commemorative arches, temples, city gates, works of art, the Grand Canal. I didn't talk about it, but in the map of the water diversion project, it mentioned the Grand Canal. This is the way that rice from the south was brought to the north. And it still operates. If you go to certain cities like Suzhou and Wuxi, you can actually take a boat ride along the Grand Canal. This is also something over 1,000 years old, which still functions. The Great Wall now functions mostly as a tourist site, but it still is something that's there and important. Next. So those are examples of material culture. It's something that people want to see when they go to China to really experience and be struck by the material accomplishments and achievements of China over the course of several millennia. But non-material culture is still extremely important. And this is something that I mentioned before, is the communist government, which came into power as a revolutionary government, has had trouble dealing with. How should they treat these thousands of years of accumulated culture? By culture, we mean a way of life, a way of looking at the world, the values and norms that shape worldview, that shape interpersonal relations, that shape a sense of self. And Confucianism is the name that we give to the general legacy of Chinese non-material culture. And Confucianism refers to Confucius, obviously, one of China's great philosophers who lived in the 6th century BC. And Confucius was a sort of a failed official. He didn't achieve what he had hoped to as an actual official. Nonetheless, he felt that he had a lot of ideas which could bring about social order. And this is another important theme that goes through China from way back when until the present day, which is how to achieve social order, how to achieve harmony, what we would call the golden rule or the golden mean, to avoid extremes. And in many ways, I feel that Confucius actually was a very great sociologist, because the question that he asked was, what makes social order possible? And he felt that the golden mean was one thing, is avoiding extremes. Another important aspect of Confucian thinking is the importance of rituals, that being involved in ritual behavior was a way of anchoring people to society and to their relations with other people. An important concept in Confucianism is this character Ren, second tone, which is made up of on the left, the thing that is sort of a slash and then a vertical line means person, which is also pronounced Ren, and then the two lines means two, not terribly surprising. And when you put them together, it's usually translated as benevolence or humanitarianism or humanitas, which indicates that the root of social order is the ability for people to get along, that you have more than that. We are not isolated individuals. We must find ways to deal and collaborate with other people, so to achieve harmony, which is going to make social order possible. Another important aspect of Confucianism, and here this is extremely sociological, is the proper behavior in a social role. That Confucius, like sociologists, believe that society is made up of a number of social positions, and that each of these social positions, such as an official or a farmer or a husband or a father or a wife or a son or a daughter, each has certain norms or expectations of proper behavior for the people who occupy those social roles. And another way in which social harmony can be achieved is if everybody understands the rules and expectations of that social role and performs them correctly, then society will be harmonious and peaceful. So a Confucian concept is the rectification of names, which means that if you occupy a particular social role, you should perform it correctly. And if you don't, then you should be corrected, or your behavior should be rectified. And another important aspect of rectification of names, of proper behavior in the social role, is self-cultivation. That it is important to reflect on whether or not you are performing your role correctly and find ways to change your behavior if you aren't. And this is where we get to the importance of education. Many people, when they stress Chinese values, Chinese society, say, well, we realize that education has played an extremely important role in China over the course of its entire history. And an important aspect to recognize is that education is not, on one hand, it's for self-cultivation, but on another hand, it's to be able to serve the state. That why does one become educated? One becomes educated so that one can take the civil service exam. One can take a test. The Chinese created the idea of a civil service exam to determine who is competent, who is capable, who has the correct knowledge to become an official and to serve the state, and therefore to serve people. So this is critical, so that the education was not to become innovative, to become creative. It was to master the ideology or the orthodoxy which informed the government, which informed the state, so that you could become an official. So that the reason for getting an education was to be able to take these tests and then to become an official, and then to move your way up through the bureaucracy to all the way to the imperial capital. So this is a really important topic that also resonates very much today, is how creative, how innovative should the education system be? Should the education system be to generate, to cultivate creative, innovative people, or people who master the ideology? In this case, not Confucianism, but communism, Marxism, Leninism. Who is qualified to become an official? Someone who knows the ideology and can spit it back, or somebody who is innovative, maybe thinks outside the box? Now, another important consequence of this idea of self-cultivation and rectification of names is that the official is supposed to rule by moral example. The official, once you've passed these tests and you can get a position, is not supposed to be an activist who is very deeply engaged in social control and in administrative work, in bureaucratic work, but to set even more important is to set an example for other people of correct morality. Now, of course, China historically has had a big problem with corruption, so that this idea of serving as a moral example has not always been implemented successfully. Next. So the last thing that I had on that slide was the five pillars, the basic pillars of Chinese society. And when I mentioned the correct performance of social roles, this is what's at the core of that. Excuse me. So there are 5 basic relationships at the core of Chinese philosophy, and these are 4 of them of the 5 are hierarchical. So we should start with number 2, which is the relation between the father and the son. The second relationship is within the family, older brother, younger brother. The third one, actually 4th, they're going down, is also within the family, the relation between husband and wife. And the fifth one is between friend and friend, often a senior friend and a junior friend, but nonetheless a more egalitarian relationship than the others. So father, son, older brother, younger brother are all hierarchical. One has more authority, more status, maybe more power than the other. The only one that is really close to being egalitarian is the relation between friends. And this stresses the idea that Chinese do not see social relations as being egalitarian, but there's always an unequal or hierarchical aspect to these relations. So the three of them are about within the family, but the number one that shapes everything else is the relation between the ruler and the subject, the emperor and his ministers, his officials. And this indicates that the ruler or the emperor is in many ways comparable to the father, that the whole society is his family. And it's not just his officials, but it's everyone in society is the offspring or the child of the ruler. So the ruler has a responsibility not only as the head of the state, the head of the empire, the head of the kingdom, but also as the pater familias, as the father of everything. So this relates to the idea of social harmony, that if everybody understands their proper role, their relationship to other people in the family and in society, then society will be harmonious. So these are referred to as the five relations. And this is really very important in understanding, even to this day, the way that Chinese see interpersonal relationships, both within the family and in the larger society. So even though in theory, it's an egalitarian revolutionary society, in point of fact, these relationships still hold and are very important. Now in red down towards the bottom, there's a Chinese word which is very important for understanding a lot of what goes on in Chinese society, and that is guanxi. Guanxi means personal relationships, but it's more than just relationships. It involves reciprocity and gift giving. And the idea is that I do a favor for you, you do a favor for me. So on the one hand, we could say, well, this looks very healthy, that people have a sense of responsibility, obligation to other people. This is quite nice, and a sense of how I can deal with other people and help make society harmonious. But other people say, guanxi is actually the root of corruption. And again, maybe Clay will get to this, but in constant attacks against corruption in China, which is one thing that's been going on under the leadership of Xi Jinping, the role of guanxi is central in that. The Chinese should stop thinking in terms of obligation and how do I make somebody dependent on me, obliged to do a favor for me, that social order is based on exchange of benefits to other people. Next. Now, again, traditionally, the Chinese saw society as not being equal, but as comprising four social strata. Not exactly classes, but certainly unequal layers or levels within society. At the top was the so-called scholar official. So I mentioned the importance of the civil service exam, that getting an education meant mastering Confucian texts and other philosophers' works, and then being able to spit it back on these exams. And if you pass the exams, then you could get in the hierarchy and possibly rise through the system. So the point of being a scholar was not the fulfillment of learning scholarly works, but it was so that one could become an official. So we think of China historically as being a meritocracy, that people who rose through the system did it on the basis of their ability to demonstrate their competence in these tests. But as I say, it was based more on a mastery of the orthodoxy as opposed to being able to think creatively. So the aristocratic class in China was made up of these scholar officials. And who, in theory, there's a famous Chinese saying, "You jiao wu lei," which means that to get an education, people of any class are able to get an education and then enter the bureaucracy. But in point of fact, it was only a small group of the wealthiest families, mostly based on land ownership, who could afford to have their sons, because it was very gendered, to have their sons leave the farm, leave economic activity in order to get an education, to spend all the time required to master the orthodoxy and then become an official. So it was a self-reinforcing mechanism that if you were of the aristocratic class, if you had the wealth and the ability to spare your sons to get an education, then they could become an official and rise up through the system, which benefited the family in turn. So the scholar officials at the top of the social strata. Then below them, the farmer. That the farmer was considered somebody who worked with worked with his hands, worked with nature, produced something that was useful both for the family and for society, and that farmers were sort of genuinely honest people. Then below the farmer is the artisan, what now we would call a worker or a craftsman. And of course, pre-industrial society, China did not have large factories. This was all home work, and in many ways, farmers during the slack season would create handicrafts or other things so that they crossed the boundary between being a farmer and being a worker, being an artisan or a craftsman. And this is important, is at the bottom of the social strata was the merchant or the trader. So we often think of Chinese as being such great entrepreneurs, such great business people. But in point of fact, throughout Chinese history, Chinese society looked down on merchants and traders. There was this sense that anybody who engaged in business was after profit, and there had to be something not quite legal, not quite nice, which made it possible for them to become successful merchants and traders and to become wealthy. And so that merchants and traders, even if they got wealthy, had a sense that they were not really a member of the elite, that they were looked down upon by other people in Chinese society. So what happened was that a lot of these merchants were trying to figure out, how can I rise through Chinese society that I'll have more respect from other people. So what they would do was then to have their sons get educated and their sons get on the scholar official track and gain this sort of social respect that they otherwise felt that they were denied. Now, because of the poverty in much of China, especially in the southeastern coastal provinces of Guangdong and of Fujian, and because of the topography there, often very mountainous, a lot of flooding, a high concentration of people, a lot of the farmer families sent their sons, usually not the oldest son who would inherit everything, but the second son abroad in theory for a short period of time to make money as a trader, and then use that money to come back home and buy more farmland to expand the economic activity and wealth of the family. So many of the Chinese farmers from Guangdong and Fujian provinces went abroad. And in particular, they went down to Southeast Asia, which is the closest area to China. And Southeast Asia is referred to as Nanyang, which means the southern seas. So that's why if you go to Southeast Asia, you find to this day large Chinese populations who still dominate economic activity. Even in Vietnam, which like China had a communist revolution and is still led by a communist party, in Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City, there is a very large Chinatown, which is the center of economic, private, small-scale business in Vietnam, in Saigon. Singapore is dominated by Chinese migrants who went down there. Even in a place like Myanmar, you still have a very important Chinese group of business people. They dominate economic activity in that country. So that the merchants and traders, even though they were at the bottom of the barrel in terms of respect and authority, nonetheless had an important role in settling a lot of Southeast Asia, and many of them made a lot of money down there. And because of the social and political unrest in China during especially the 19th and 20th centuries, they didn't go back. They stayed in Southeast Asia. So that's why you still have these important Chinese communities throughout that region. Next. So this is just another way of looking at the hierarchy. The Shi, the scholar officials, the Nong, the farmers and peasants, Gong or artisans, and Shang, merchants. Next. Now this illustration is the character Wang. You may know the Chinese Mandarin has 4 tones. You pronounce, there's a limited number of sounds, and you pronounce them in different registers. So this character is second tone Wang, and it illustrates a lot of the philosophy that I was talking about, is that the top line represents heaven. And Chinese heaven is not like our heaven. It's sort of an amorphous force that has an influence over what goes on in human society and in nature. So you've got heaven at the top, and the middle line, the middle horizontal line, represents society, and the bottom line represents earth. And the vertical line that links them all, it represents the emperor. That the emperor's job as Wang, king, is to link heaven and society and earth. And if the emperor is virtuous and his bureaucrats are virtuous, then heaven will bless them and it will all be harmonious. And another important concept, which I didn't get to, is called the mandate of heaven, which indicates that if the emperor is doing a good job, then this and nature is benevolent and society is peaceful, this indicates that the emperor has earned the mandate of heaven. Heaven has blessed the emperor and his regime. However, if you have natural disasters and social unrest, that means that the bureaucracy is corrupt, the emperor is incompetent and corrupt, and that it's going to be the heaven has withdrawn its mandate, and it will be legitimate for there to be a revolution or some sort of rebellion, which will overthrow that emperor and probably overthrow that dynasty as well. So I hope now everybody knows how to write that character, because it's very important to know the correct stroke order. Next. So you can go through, so that these are words explaining what I just talked about, that the ruler is the link between heaven and earth. I mentioned the concept of mandate of heaven, Tianming. Another important aspect of Chinese culture is the idea that history moves in cycles, not linear progression. So this is where you get a difference from Marxism, which maybe Clay will talk about. Marxism is a theory of history, that history moves through stages such as primitive communism, feudalism, capitalism, socialism, and communism. But Chinese traditionally don't believe that history moves in any particular direction. It just keeps moving in cycles, that there will be the loss of a mandate of heaven, an emperor and his family, his regime will be overthrown. You'll have a new emperor and a new ruling group which will come into power with a lot of competence, a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of commitment, and there will be a period where there's a rise and improvement in society. The mandate of heaven will clearly be granted, but then over time they will lose the mandate of heaven. You'll have corruption, you'll have incompetence, you'll have popular rebellion, and then boom, it collapses, and then the cycle starts all over again. So one of the things that the the revolutionaries in 20th and 21st century China have done is to try to get people to think that history does not move in cycles, but China has progressed. That this shows that there's been a revolution in thinking about history and China's development. This idea of a cycle, not only of rise and fall, but also of unity and disunity, is captured in the first sentence of one of China's most popular historical novels, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Sangguo Yanyi, which basically every Chinese child knows, doesn't memorize too long. They know it, and a lot of Chinese fiction and Chinese films and Chinese stories grow out of this Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a fictionalization of Chinese history. And the first line of it is 分久必合，合久必分, which means those which have long been separated or apart eventually will unite, and those which have long been united must fall apart. This encapsulates this view of Chinese history as moving in cycles, falling apart, unity, then falling apart again and reunited. And this partially explains one of the main themes, which I'm sure Clay will talk about, is Xi Jinping's obsession with stability and with unity, and that China must not fall apart. And that one of the roles, the important obligations of the Chinese leadership is to make sure that China remains united and remains stable. And so there's one more line there, I think, Samuel, and that the relation between center and localities is a very critical aspect of this. China is so huge that it's really has been historically very, very difficult to maintain stability and unity. So you've had a long history of rebellions, occasional revolutions, but mostly rebellions, just social unrest. And that's why leaders are so obsessed with establishing control between the center and the localities and making sure that local officials carry out the policies which come from the center. So the relation between the center and the localities is something that has a very long history in China. And to this day, there's a sort of cynical statement, which you hear quite a bit, which is 上有政策，下有对策, which means that you can have policies from above, but then counter policies from below, that local leaders often listen to what the policies that come down from Beijing are, but they don't implement them because they feel it might harm their interests, personal interests, or their localities. And so they go about their own business. Another line which refers to this is, heaven is high and the emperor is far away, that the further you are from Beijing, the more you can get away with, that the capital really isn't going to be aware of what's going on at the local level. And as long as you report to Beijing that you're, yes, I'm carrying out the policies just the way you told me, and if they don't send people down to investigate, then local officials can get away with quite a bit. And again, this is something that Xi Jinping in particular has been trying to deal with, is to try to get local officials in line to actually implement the policies that are coming from the center. Next. So that in addition to Confucianism, there is a which emphasizes harmony and social order. There's another mainstream in Chinese tradition, Chinese philosophy, which is referred to as legalism. And this is a picture of the famous terracotta warriors outside of Xi'an, which was traditionally, its ancient name was Chang'an, which means eternal peace. And the main east-west road in Beijing that goes by the Forbidden City is called Chang'an Street, Chang'an Boulevard. Now, the first emperor who united China, or given credit for uniting China, was known as Qin Shi Huang, which means the first emperor of the Qin dynasty. And legalism, you want to go to the next line. Legalism is based on severe laws and punishments, rather than relying on local officials to be moral exemplars who will implement policies. It was important to have severe laws and punishments to show that what the consequences would be of not implementing policies or of disobeying the laws. The Qin Shi Huang was known as just a brutal emperor who burned books and buried officials and scholars alive. That people who did not follow his rules faced extremely severe and violent consequences. So legalism believes, unlike, again, in contrast to Confucianism, of a strong central authority to enrich and strengthen the state. So it really placed the benefits of the state above certainly above individuals, and concentrating a lot of power in the hands of the emperor. Next. Now, one of the things that I've been emphasizing diversity, and one of the things that has held China together over the millennia is the fact that there's a common written language. This is one of the miracles of China, is that there is a common written language, but the same characters can be pronounced in very different ways throughout the country. So that if you look at this map, you can see in this light green part here, this is where what we call Mandarin is the dominant language, but it's pronounced. There are many dialects or accents. It's pronounced in many different ways across the country, and this is where the common written language comes in very conveniently, very importantly. Is that even if I can't understand a word you're saying, you think you're speaking Mandarin and I think I'm speaking Mandarin, the fact that we can write down the character that we're trying to say and show it to another person is one thing that has held China together. Oh, that's the character that you meant. So the characters that I've written there, I haven't written, but the characters that are there in Mandarin, standard Mandarin, which is based on Beijing dialect, is pronounced Chifan, but in other parts of China, it would be pronounced quite differently. For instance, in Shanghai, where I spent it's my main base in China, it's pronounced Cheve. In Taiwan or in southern Fujian province, which is opposite Taiwan, down here off the coast, it's pronounced Japeng. So those are just two examples of the way that the same characters are mutually incomprehensible. But if you show the character to somebody, they'll understand what you're talking about. So Mandarin in mainland China is called Putonghua, which literally means the common language. In Taiwan, Mandarin is called Guoyu, which means the national language. But in addition, we can see from this map, so there's a debate about, do we refer to Shanghainese, Taiwanese, and so on, and Cantonese as dialects of Mandarin or as separate languages, like the difference between Italian and Spanish. We don't call them dialects of Latin, we call them languages, separate languages. So this is a debate among linguists dealing with China. And but you can see here that in addition to the variants of Mandarin, you do have a lot of the 55 official minority groups speak their own languages. Tibetan is a totally different language. Uyghur, Kazakh, these are Turkish languages. Mongolian, again, Mongolian is related, I think, to Korean and Japanese. So you've got a lot of these different languages that are not just spin-offs of Mandarin. And so that's, again, an issue that the central government in Beijing or wherever it has been over history faces, is trying to get everybody to speak some sort of a common language, a Putonghua, to recognize that there is a national language that everybody should learn, that language is so critical for unifying the country. Now, I talked about knowing characters, that if everybody shares their knowledge of a Chinese character, this is a way of unifying the country. But a lot of these characters involve what we call strokes, a lot of different strokes in order to write them. So one of the things which makes literacy very, very complicated and challenging. So one of the things that the communists did was to simplify hundreds of these characters, to remove a lot of strokes. So some people said, oh, it's these full characters are so beautiful, you really can't change them. By simplifying them, you're making them quite ugly. But the response was, well, but by simplifying them, we're making it possible for hundreds of millions of more people to become literate, which is an even more important benefit. It outweighs what you might call uglifying the characters. So now but in mainland China, they use simplified characters. But in Taiwan and in Hong Kong and in Chinese communities outside of China, including in Chinatown in the United Chinatowns in the US and in Europe, they still use unsimplified characters. So there's still in the Chinese diaspora, there still is a great variety in ability to read simplified characters. The Romanization system, meaning taking Chinese sounds and using Roman letters to express them, is referred to as pinyin, which means spelling the sound. And there have been efforts over the decades, over the centuries, to try to get everybody in China to use pinyin, which they theoretically is easier to learn than these complicated characters. But it's never succeeded. The lobby for maintaining the use of characters has been too strong, and that writing characters is too central to Chinese culture and Chinese self-identity. So whereas in Japan, you have characters, but you mostly use two alphabets, and in Korea, the culture king Sejong created his own alphabet, and most Koreans only learn a few characters. And in Vietnam, they've largely done away with characters altogether. In China, even though you see signs in pinyin all over the place, generally people still rely on characters. And Chinese language is full of literary allusions, of slogans, of colloquialisms. I mentioned Romance of the Three Kingdoms. That's something everybody would immediately recognize, any sort of literary allusion from that. Also, famous novel, The Dream of the Red Chamber. There's an opera was just produced in San Francisco, I think last month, based on this novel that, again, everybody in China is familiar with. Next. So wrapping up, this idea of China as the Middle Kingdom. China has had trouble seeing itself as a state, as a modern state in relation to other nation states. That China traditionally sees itself as civilization itself, that everybody else is some sort of a barbarian. And foreign relations or international relations was traditionally referred to as barbarian management. And there were periods when the Mongols or Manchus actually conquered China and established their own dynasties, the Yuan dynasty and the Qing dynasty. But Chinese civilization, Chinese philosophy that we've been talking about, has been so powerful that it ended up sinifying or sinicizing the Mongol and Manchu political or cultural social elite. China still to this day has trouble of thinking of itself as an equal nation among other nations, even though they say China is just a developing country and we identify ourselves with other developing countries. Don't believe it. International relations was seen as a tributary system. When people came from other countries or other tribes to the capital, wherever that would be, they would bring gifts. So the trade was actually seen not as a relationship between equals, but as inferior peoples showing their inferior position as regarded China. And final slide. And this will be central to what Clay is going to talk about, and is one of the main themes that goes through Chinese international relations and Chinese leadership today. That in 1840 to 1842, you had what was referred to as the Opium War, when the British tried to open China up, which had been closed, in particular to the import of opium. And the Treaty of Nanjing or Nanking in 1842 established a system, the unequal treaty system, where foreigners led by the British had these enforced treaties over the Qing government, which granted these foreigners the ability to live in China, to do business in China, to govern themselves by their own laws and not be subject to Chinese law. That's why I refer to as extraterritoriality, that even on what we might consider Chinese territory, the British, the Americans, the Japanese, the French, the Germans all obeyed only their own laws, not Chinese laws. In 1894 and 1895, there was a war between China and Japan, which was particularly galling to the Chinese because they had always looked upon Japan as being an inferior group of people. They referred to them as the dwarf people. But the Japanese whooped them in 1894 and 1895 and imposed another treaty over them, which ended up taking Taiwan, which was poorly governed from the mainland, to Japan as a Japanese colony. So from 1895 to 1945, Taiwan was actually a Japanese colony, not ruled by China. A small group of officials in the middle of the 19th century, after the Qing dynasty began, after the Opium War, increasingly humiliated by foreigners, said that we need to learn from these they're barbarians, but they're very powerful barbarians, how to strengthen ourselves. The Japanese took the same tack and succeeded in using Western technology and Western science in order to strengthen themselves and to resist foreign imperialism and then become imperialists themselves. But the Chinese failed. The self-strengthening movement only had a very small positive impact. And this raises an extremely important question to this very day of what's called Tiyong, which is, what is the Chinese essence? What can China change in order to become modern and strong, but at the same time not lose what's essentially Chinese? How can we, if you speak on behalf of the Chinese, how can we learn from science and technology to become strong, but not become just another country dominated by foreign ideas and by foreign powers? So beginning in the 19th century and continuing to this day, there has been what they refer to as a quest for wealth and power, Fuqiang. The first character, Fu, means wealth. The second one, Qiang, means strength. And actually in Japan and Korea, those characters are still, that concept is still really important. How can we, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, become wealthy and strong and be able to stand up to foreign powers? And this then brings us finally to one of Xi Jinping's favorite concepts of Fuxing, which means rejuvenation. How can we become great like we were for so many thousands of years until we were humiliated by these imperialists? How can China become rejuvenated? So the Fu, this is pronounced Fuxing. It's a different Fu, different character. But it raises this question, which is one of the things that's driving Xi Jinping, and one of the reasons that he was so angry, not only he, but the leadership was so angry at Nancy Pelosi's visit last week, because they felt that that was a challenge to China's ability to become wealthy and powerful and to rejuvenate back to the glory days which it had held in the past. So I will stop with that, probably way too much information, and be happy to take your questions and comments.
Wow, Tom, thank you for that expensive history lesson. Framing for our teachers the understanding of the essence of China, bringing in 5,000-year-old history to the modern day. During the break, we also show you a video on the ping pong diplomacy leading up to Nixon's trip, which Tom had alluded to in his presentation. Don't forget to fill out the speaker survey form that will be in the chat box. Now we have some time for Q&A, followed by curriculum discussion with Saya McKenna from our Teachers Advisory Group. Please see the Jamboard link in the chat box. Click raise your hand, and during the curriculum conversation, we will unmute your mics to have an interactive conversation. This is simply amazing. So there are quite a few questions that is popping up. So I'm going to ask the question on behalf of the teachers, and we're very lucky to be able to have Tom here to answer them live for you. The first one up, it says approximately 92% ethnic Han Chinese, majority the main factor in keeping China as one state, despite all this diversity and challenges, or are there other important factors to consider?
Well, the fact that I didn't get into the whole issue of minority nationalities. Officially, there are 56 what they call nationalities or ethnic groups, Minzu, in China. 93% of them are referred to as Han. There is a lot of diversity among Han as well. I didn't get into it, but Northern Chinese tend to be physically different from Shanghainese area, people in central China, and then people in the south. So there is some diversity, physical diversity among the Han, but they are about 93% of the population, and concentrated largely in that eastern, the coastal area, and in the near coastal area. But in the interior, mostly on the border areas, is where you have these officially 55 minority groups, many of whom have they're somewhat similar to the Chinese in terms of body structure, physical structure, some of their culture. But then you have some like the Tibetans, or like especially the Turkic people, like the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, who are very much in the news these days, who come physically very, very different, culturally, historically, quite a bit different. But the fact that the Han are more concentrated and they control the weapons, they control the military and so on, gives them and they have a sense in some degree about being surrounded, because most of these minorities are on the borders. So there is a sense of being surrounded, and it's important to establish control over them. So part of it is population. Part of it is control of the means of coercion. And part of it is, one of the things I've been trying to stress is the importance of Chinese culture to this day, and of self-identity, that they feel that we've proven ourselves over the last several thousand years, except for a blip beginning in the middle of the 19th century, when you have these imperialists who occupied us and established extraterritoriality and so on. So there's a lot of different factors that go into the ability of the Han to dominate the political and social systems.
That's great. Thank you. I mean, a follow-up question actually was very interesting, is why does China always think it's superior to others? What are the theoretical, culture, and historical roots of thoughts?
Well, that relates to what I just said about the border areas. The border areas so most of these minorities are on the border of the core of where Chinese civilization arose. Now, there's some debate. Used to say Chinese civilization arose in the Yangtze River area, say where Xi'an, I talked about Chang'an, where the terracotta warriors, maybe people, that's the origin of Chinese civilization. Other people say, no, Chinese civilization actually arose in the Yangtze River area. But nonetheless, those are going to be among mostly Han people, though there were some minorities and the Han intermarried with them. But most of these minorities, like Mongols, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Zhuang, Yao, Miao, so on and so forth, are on the border areas. And most of those people also live across borders. The Chinese traditionally did not see themselves as a nation state with borders. China, Zhongguo, was the middle kingdom. It equaled civilization. And you did have these minority people, many of whom didn't have their own written languages, their philosophy, their science, nothing was as developed as the Chinese. So the Chinese just basically looked down on all of them. And I mentioned the tributary system, where these people would come periodically and present gifts to the emperor, acknowledging their inferior status. So there was really little to make the Han, the Chinese, even when they were conquered by Mongols and by Manchus, they sinicized them so that these Mongols and Manchus identified with China and not with their former. They lost a lot of the things, the characteristics that had made them somewhat unique and somewhat special. So it was only when you had these new style barbarians who were able to conquer China in the 19th century, because the Qing dynasty was so corrupt and incompetent. But that was a blip. China now is back on the road to rejuvenation. But it's important to maintain control over these minorities, many of whom, as I say, are on both sides of the border. So you've got Inner Mongolia, Nemang, which is a officially autonomous region. It's a province of China. But across the border is the independent Republic of Mongolia, right? And people cross the border and they may still have a sense of themselves as being Mongols, as opposed to being part of China or part of Mongolia. And one of the challenges faced by the leadership in China is convincing those in Neimang that you're Chinese, you're a citizen of the People's Republic of China, not of Mongolia. And on the southern border with Vietnam, with Laos, with Myanmar, you have, again, the same people on both sides of the border. So it's really a big challenge to try to maintain control over them, but at the same time, seeing them as really not the same as the Han.
There's a very interesting question here about guanxi. Coming from one of the teachers, it says, in AP comparative government, I teach guanxi as relations, which appears to be correct. But in an effort to get students to relate to the term and understand it, I tie it to a kind of mafia situation or mafia-like relations, duties, etc. Is that correct?
I didn't understand though. What kind of relations?
Mafia, as in the Italian mafia.
That's not too far off. I mean, there is it's a similar sort of thing. It's obligation. So if you think of The Godfather, when James Caan, blessed memory, when Marlon Brando was burying him, and he wants a favor from the Undertaker. I mean, I haven't seen it in decades, but nonetheless, it's the same sort of thing. I do a favor for you, you do a favor for me. Even if I don't want you, even if I don't expect a return favor from you right away, that you are obligated to me. And somewhere down the line, I have the right to call that favor in. And so that's very similar to mafia. But there's a lot of, you could say, oh, there's nothing unique about guanxi. Every society has obligation and reciprocity. But one of the things I picked up living in China is that guanxi was almost like a religion, that people just talked about guanxi all the time. Mm-hmm. And I have really good guanxi with such and such a person. So if I need something, I know I can call on them. They think of guanxi first, as opposed to thinking of other like laws and rules. Guanxi overrules everything.
It's almost like being a power broker if you have the right guanxi with somebody, right?
Absolutely.
So you talk a lot about, heaven mandate and Wang being, having a very kind of hierarchical structure within the Chinese mentality. So does the concept of mandate of heaven applies to Xi Jinping and how he operates?
I think it does. I think it very much does. You could cite a lot. And so again, the communists want to present themselves as not believing in these feudal traditions, superstitious traditions like mandate of heaven. But one of the themes I've been trying to stress is how intractable, how deep Chinese culture and Chinese tradition are. So that if, for instance, I remember I was in China, it was in 1991, and there were very serious floods in the Yangtze. And at that time, Li Peng, who was a very unpopular prime minister, went to the flooded areas, and he put on hip boots and rain gear to demonstrate that the leadership was in charge, that especially over water, which I emphasized, that this was another water disaster, but the leadership is in charge and will be able to control this. And don't even for a minute think that this means we're losing the mandate of heaven. Even if they don't say it, at least people like me say this is one of the things they're looking at. So now we get to COVID, and maybe Clay's going to talk about this, but that's one reason that Xi Jinping committed the government, and especially his own status, his own legitimacy, to zero COVID, to stamping out COVID entirely. And as a way of showing that even if it's unspoken, the Communist Party under me has the mandate of heaven, and we're going to get through this. And don't even question the fact that the Communist Party can deal with this. And you look around the world and there's so much chaos in other countries, and you've got the spread of this disease, but look at what a good job we've done stamping this out. So again, even if I don't have to say it, you can see that mandate of heaven I've got the mandate of heaven representing the party.
Thank you. That was great. I know there's going to be more questions that is being sent in. And we will actually use some of it also as we go through with the question and answer session with Clay. I think Tom will be staying also, so we can have more opportunity to answer some of your questions. So I'm going to pass the screen to our Teachers Advisory Group, and specifically Zaya McKenna, who will help work with the teachers in getting some of these conversations and ideas into the Jamboard to ignite a conversation with the teachers about how to use this material into the classroom. So Zaya, the screen's yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Sandra, and thank you, Tom, Professor Gold, who has long been my teacher, actually. And I so appreciate this presentation as an educator and a classroom teacher. It's so incredibly sweeping and also specific. And having had the advantage of hearing some of this material before in a prior workshop, I also want to talk a little bit about the concrete ways that it can apply to our classroom practice. And for me personally, at least as a participant in a workshop like this, I find it valuable to just gain content, and boy, there's a lot of that to take away from my own practice, to think about the applications to my own classroom, and then also to collaborate with other teachers, which is a little bit hard in this webinar format. But I just want to invite people again to take advantage of this Jamboard and put and post some of the ideas that are coming to you as you think about your own application, because this is so valuable to the kind of community that we build in as educators. So please don't hesitate, don't be shy to just start sharing some of those ideas and resources. Like one of the examples Sandra used in the question was, the use of analogies. Guanxi as a mafia exercise is very interesting in looking at relationships. So while people are doing that, I also wanted to just talk a little bit more about the content piece and the way in which the 1990 Institute has additional resources that apply to Professor Gold's presentation specifically. And that if you go to the website, you'll see that the Jamboard, the presentation, and then actually some of the some additional resources are available. And this is something that Professor Gold has actually curated. It's a lesson guide with reference materials. And I just think like that will be a very valuable takeaway. And I also wanted to just share a couple of examples from my school, which is in Oakland, California, the Headroy School. And we teach about China in the 6th grade, in the 9th grade, and in the 12th grade. And in the 6th grade, it's ancient civilizations. In the 9th grade, it's within the context of world history. In the 12th grade, it is comparative politics, or I taught a class of the rise of industrial Asia. And I was thinking about, as I was listening to this presentation, the ways that that the information Professor Gold presented can apply to any one of those 3 classes. And just quickly, by way of illustration, in the 6th grade in ancient civilizations, when they're looking at Confucianism and legalism, our 6th grade teachers actually run a simulation where, unbeknownst to the students, they start practicing class, they start administering class in the format of those philosophies. So you can imagine in the Confucian classroom, there's a lot of group work. There are leaders, there are lots of quizzes and assessments, but there's a sense of building community and harmony and appointing people to hierarchical positions to try to get to the desired learning outcomes. They come in the next day and are in for a very different experience in a legalistic classroom where there are extremely strict rules, and the teacher will send them out of the classroom and give them a detention if they are turning and talking to their neighbors. And so that's an illustration of the way that some of these principles could be put into practice in a middle school history classroom. In the 9th grade world history class, they look at some of those same philosophies and principles, And they study, for example, Taoism, Buddhism, and ancient religions or world religions. And they come up with artifacts that modern day represent some of the principles of these religions. And of course, in the comparative government and industrial history of East Asia, there's so many interesting ways that this interplay of past and present can relate. And that's actually something that I loved about this theme, is whether you're looking at ancient history and applying it to modern day or sort of student-centered applications, or if you're looking at current events and case studies. Like we looked at the structure of a company and the way that the family hierarchy relates to that. We looked at relational contracting and guanxi and the way that that influences. We looked at the relationship of information, for example, as being the relationship of the individual to information as being different and perhaps related to hierarchical structures, and why controls, for example, censorship and controls over media are influenced by that. And then, some of the control over nature philosophy that Professor Gold was talking about was rooted in our study of energy, or we looked at, nuclear energy or dams, et cetera. And so those are just some examples from my own experience. I also wanted to share the screen and show you that Professor Gold has another set of ideas and suggested activities and discussion topics. And I wondered if Professor Gold, you wouldn't mind speaking to some of the things that you yourself might have seen as successful ways of implementing your material in the classroom.
Oh boy. I think what you just said about one day running a Confucian classroom and one day running a legalistic classroom was very creative. I hope you didn't burn the books and bury the scholars. I was always afraid of that at Berkeley. Of course, comparing capitalism and communism is probably more, that's in Clay's bailiwick. I think the whole century of humiliation, beginning with the Opium War of 1840 to 1842, is a critical thing to understand. I think that's one of the motivations behind Xi Jinping's idea of rejuvenation and of the quest for wealth and power, that the Chinese feel, I mean, you don't know what people really feel, but the part of the education system, I talked about the importance of mastering the orthodoxy. People have to study Xi Jinping's writings, and a lot now that's very important, much more than, they don't read Marx and Lenin and much Mao or anything like that. It's Xi Jinping all day, all the time. And he keeps emphasizing rejuvenation in the century of humiliation. And we Americans really can't understand the degree to which this drives a lot of their policy. And some of it is, of course, I don't want to use the word necessarily cynical, but some of it is a tool of control, that if you challenge the leadership, this shows that you want to weaken China. You're not committed to rejuvenation. And that the way to commit to rejuvenation, this is very legalist, is to submit. And because again, this is sort of getting ahead maybe into Clay's territory, is that communism is a theory of Marxism is a theory of history, which moves through stages. And to become a member of the Communist Party means you have mastered you've mastered the science of history. It's a science. It's not a philosophy. Marxism is a science. And you know which direction history is moving. And one reason you join the party is to help history move in that direction. So that if you challenge that, if you even have questions about it, that shows you are not committed to the goals. And also the common people just don't have the consciousness to really understand that. That's one reason that communists only comprise about 5% of the total population of the country. They're thought of theoretically as the vanguard, the people with the highest consciousness. So that's why they can keep, if If you don't accept the idea of the century of humiliation, that's more proof that your consciousness is not high enough. And that's why you have to study more and to commit yourself to the goals which Xi Jinping, as the most brilliant leader of China of the last several decades, have worked out for you.
Sandra,
I actually have a question for you, Tom. How did you get interested in China? And what can the teachers do in today's classroom to ignite an interest?
Well, I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, originally, and there was in my high school, middle school and high school, there was one in my class. There was one Asian American, a Chinese American girl, and her brother was in the year ahead of us. There were very nothing in the way of Asian, contact with Asian Americans. And even if we did a class on world civilization, nobody had been to China. There was no real, spark. But I went to Oberlin College, which had a long history, which I was unaware of sending graduates as missionaries into China. And just something different to do freshman year, I took a course in Asian history. And the professor had lived in China in the 1930s and 40s and told great stories, which really piqued my interest. And I was originally just going to be an English major. I didn't have anything more, any other plan, more direct. And a group of us, after that freshman class in Asian history, made a pact. We dared each other to start beginning Chinese. And this is in the 60s, Chinese was only offered in a very small number of large research universities like Berkeley. It was not offered in liberal arts colleges, but because Oberlin had this long history with China, I think is the reason they offered it. And from day one, I loved the study of Chinese. I just was totally grabbed. Nothing that I had studied before grabbed me that way. And in those days, there was no thought that Americans would ever be able to go to mainland China, and we may be headed there now, again, unfortunately. So the only way you could really experience Chinese culture as a living thing was to go to Taiwan. So my first trip out of the US was to Taiwan for a summer of Chinese language training. And it reaffirmed my love of the language. And also I just felt so comfortable and excited living in a Chinese environment that I committed myself to the study of China and the teaching of China. And then when the US and China established, before diplomatic relations actually, but an educational exchange, I was accepted into the first group of American exchange students in February of 1979. I went to China for a year. And this was the period of the beginning of the reforms. And it was a really exciting time to be in China. I mentioned Nixon's trip with all of the, I'm a long, strong advocate of engagement. And that's being challenged now about it's you people who stressed engagement. It's your fault that China's so strong right now. We should have never engaged with China. We've created our own enemy, and some people say. So it just, it's just constantly changing and constantly presenting challenges. So even though I've retired from teaching, I can't quit China. And I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to go back, but I can't quit it. I hope that answers your question, Sandra.
Thank you. And I'm sure that this cohort of teachers who are present are inspiring some of that same interest in their own classrooms. I saw on the Jamboard there are some interesting things also from language teachers about the way that this context helps them in the, putting more meaning into the teaching of language as well. And I just wanted to thank people for sharing on that Jamboard and open the floor just one last time, because I know we're due for a break, to teachers who would like to share something that they have implemented in their classroom that they think would be valuable to the group. And I think that's our cue that people are ready for a break. But I also wanted to just thank those of you who have contributed to this page, and there's still time to do that if you start thinking particularly about this second piece, which is how would you use this material in the classroom? Processing time is important, I know, as a teacher, and you may want to keep thinking about that before you post a response. And this Jamboard will be live and available to you, and also accessible via the website, even after this session is concluded. So Sandra, did you want to close us out?
Yes, thank you very much. My gosh, thank you for all your participation. I know there's still many more questions that we haven't answered, but we'll try to do that later on as well. So next up, we're going to have a break, and Clay Doobie, I can promise you, will give you a very exciting and thought-provoking presentation. During this break, we're going to show you some original video produced by the 1990 Institute on China and on the comparison of China and the US. We'll see you back here at 11 o'clock sharp. Please keep this link open. And I will be sharing some screen with you of things that we have done as part of the Institute. So thank you. We'll see you back soon.